There is a wall in Cusco, Peru that should not exist. Not according to modern engineering standards, not according to what we know about Inca capability.
Somewhere in the heart of Peru, there's a stone wall that has survived every earthquake that has ever tried to knock it down. Colonial cathedrals built right beside it have collapsed, been rebuilt, and collapsed again. This wall has not moved. Not one stone out of place. Not one crack. Not one gap you could slide a knife into. For centuries, people have stood in front of it and asked the same question. How did anyone build this without modern tools? In 2024, engineers finally ran the numbers, and what they found does not just explain the mystery. It deepens it in ways nobody expected. The wall in question runs along a narrow street in Cusco, Peru, once the capital of the Inca Empire. Locals and tourists know it by the giant block embedded partway up its length. A stone carved with 12 separate flat faces, each one meeting its neighbors at a slightly different angle, all of them pressed together so tightly that no mortar was ever needed. This is not an isolated curiosity. Walk through Cusco, out to the hilltop fortress of Sexehuaman, or down into the Sacred Valley to sites like Ollantaytambo and Pisac, and you find the same style repeated again and again. Massive stones, some estimated to weigh over 100 tons, shaped into irregular polygons and locked together with a precision that modern masons still find difficult to replicate by hand. For a long time, the standard explanation was simple. The Inca were skilled, patient, and had a lot of labor available. Using hammerstones made of harder rock, workers would peck away at the surface of a softer stone like andesite or limestone, slowly grinding it down until it matched its neighbor. Given enough time and enough people, the story goes, you could produce walls like this. It's a reasonable explanation, and there's real evidence for the pecking technique. Archaeologists have found stone hammers at Inca quarry sites, and experimental archaeologists have used similar methods to shape stone by hand. But that explanation has always left one big question sitting quietly in the background. Pecking explains how you might smooth the surface. It does not fully explain how these joints reach the kind of tolerances we're talking about. Tight enough in places that you can't feel where one stone ends and the next begins. That's the gap the 2024 research tried to close, and it approached the problem from an angle nobody had really tested before. Instead of asking how the stones were carved, a team of structural engineers asked a different question entirely. Why don't these walls fall down? Cusco sits in one of the most seismically active regions in South America. Earthquakes here are not rare events, they're a recurring fact of life, and the historical record backs that up. Quakes in the 17th, 18th, and 20th centuries flattened Spanish colonial buildings across the city. The Inca stonework standing right next to those ruins came through largely unscathed. Using three-dimensional laser scanning, the researchers built detailed digital models of sections of Inca walls, then simulated how those structures would respond to real seismic recordings from the region. Each stone was modeled as its own rigid block, interacting with its neighbors, rather than treating the wall as one solid slab, the way a lot of older models had. That distinction turns out to matter a great deal. When you model it that way, you can watch, block by block, what actually happens to the wall during a quake. What the simulation showed is that the irregular, many-sided shape of each stone is not a decorative flourish or a byproduct of available materials. It is functioning almost like a shock absorber built directly into the architecture. When the ground shakes, the polygonal joints allow individual stones to shift very slightly against each other, rotating and sliding in small increments, dissipating the seismic energy across dozens of contact points instead of concentrating stress on any single edge. A rectangular block wall, by contrast, tends to transfer force in straight lines along flat joints, which is exactly the kind of loading that causes walls to crack and topple. The multi-angled Inca joints spread that same force out in multiple directions at once, letting the wall flex just enough to survive without ever losing its overall shape. Researchers described it almost like a structure that can breathe during an earthquake and then settle right back into place once the shaking stops. That finding on its own is remarkable because it means the Inca were, whether through observation, tradition, or trial and error passed down over generations, applying a structural principle that modern seismic engineering did not formally describe until the 20th century. The idea of deliberately allowing controlled movement in a structure rather than trying to make it perfectly rigid is a cornerstone of how we design earthquake-resistant buildings today. Somehow, without written language, without modern physics, without computer modeling, builders in the Andes arrived at a version of that same insight, expressed entirely through the shape of stone. But here's where the newer research gets genuinely interesting, and where a lot of the popular retellings of this story stop short. The simulations also modeled what happens when the shaking gets stronger. Even these remarkably resilient walls have a limit. Push the ground acceleration past a certain threshold, and the models show real damage starting to occur, with specific points of the wall becoming vulnerable to overturning rather than just flexing. In other words, this isn't some magical, indestructible technology. It's an extremely well-optimized design for the kinds of earthquakes that occur most often in that region, with a breaking point like anything else. That nuance rarely makes it into the more sensational retellings online, but it actually makes the achievement more impressive, not less. The builders weren't working with some unexplainable force. They were working within the real physical limits of stone and friction, and they pushed those limits about as far as they could go using nothing but careful observation and generations of accumulated technique. So, does this settle the question of how the stones were carved in the first place? Not entirely, and it's worth being honest about that instead of pretending the mystery is fully solved. The seismic modeling tells us why the shape works so well. It doesn't by itself walk us through every step of the actual carving and fitting process, and that's a genuinely separate question that archaeologists and engineers are still working on from different angles. What we do know, from decades of field work rather than speculation, fills in a lot of that picture. Quarry sites near Cusco still contain partially finished blocks, some abandoned mid-process, giving us a rare window into the actual workflow. Tool marks on unfinished stones match the hammerstones found nearby. Some blocks were roughed out at the quarry using controlled fracturing along the natural grain of the rock, dramatically reducing the amount of material that needed to be removed by hand later. Only after a stone was moved into position, often using ramps, log rollers, and enormous amounts of coordinated labor, would the finer polygonal fitting begin, worked in place against its actual neighbors, rather than carved to some abstract measurement beforehand. That detail matters more than it might seem. A lot of the popular mystery around these walls comes from imagining a single mason carving a 12-sided stone in isolation, then somehow hoping it fits. That's not how the process worked. The fitting happened iteratively, stone against stone, in position, with each new block shaped directly against the ones already placed. It's slow, it's labor-intensive, and it does not require lost technology. It requires exactly what the historical and archaeological record actually shows the Inca state was extremely good at: organizing massive coordinated labor projects with a level of planning and logistics that rivaled anything else in the world at the time. It's worth addressing directly, because it comes up constantly in comment sections and other videos on this topic. The idea that this precision is somehow beyond what Bronze Age or pre-Bronze Age tools could achieve, and that the walls must be the work of some earlier, more advanced, unknown civilization that the Incas simply inherited or reused. It's an appealing story, and it's easy to see why it spreads. But it isn't supported by the physical or documentary evidence, and it's worth saying that plainly rather than dancing around it. The idea largely comes from 19th and 20th century assumptions about ancient societies. The notion that a civilization without metal tools, or a written script in the European sense, couldn't possibly organize itself to produce something this precise. Modern archaeology has moved well past that assumption. The Inca Empire, at its height, controlled a road network stretching thousands of miles, ran a sophisticated administrative and record-keeping system using knotted cords called quipu, and coordinated labor on a scale that required real logistical sophistication. Building precise stonework with patience, generational skill, and large organized workforces isn't actually inconsistent with what we know the Inca state was capable of. It's consistent with it. There's also a persistent claim that construction quality varies across these sites, with the most precise stonework sitting lowest and oldest, and cruder stonework appearing to be later additions, and that this pattern proves an older, more skilled civilization built the foundations before Inca hands ever touched the site. It's true that quality does vary across different structures, and even within the same wall. And that's a real, documented feature of these sites. But the explanation for that variation doesn't require inventing an unknown civilization. Cusco and the surrounding valley were built, expanded, damaged by earthquakes, and repaired repeatedly over roughly a century of Inca rule and, in some cases, by later colonial-era hands, working with far less skill or care than the original builders. Different work crews, different quarries, different points in that timeline, and different purposes for a given section of wall, whether it was a temple foundation meant to project imperial power or a quick repair after a tremor, would naturally produce different levels of craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from mortar and fill layers consistently lines up with the 15th century, the period of Pachacuty's reign, which is exactly when the major building campaigns across the empire are independently documented to have taken place. None of this is meant to strip away the wonder of what's actually standing in Cusco, because the real story doesn't need embellishment to be extraordinary. Stand in front of that 12-angled stone, and you are looking at engineering that modern structural analysis is only now fully able to explain, achieved with tools that, on paper, sound completely inadequate for the job. The 2024 seismic modeling didn't uncover a hidden lost civilization or a forgotten technology. What it uncovered is something arguably more impressive, hard, measurable proof that a civilization working with stone hammers, timber, rope, and an enormous amount of organized human effort figured out, through careful observation over generations, principles of earthquake engineering that the rest of the world would not formally understand for another 500 years. They built it into the very shape of the stone itself. That's really the secret these new findings reveal. Not a lost civilization, not a forgotten technology, and not some anomaly that breaks the laws of physics. It's a genuinely brilliant, homegrown engineering tradition, refined block by block, earthquake by people who paid close attention to what worked and what didn't, and who had the patience and the organization to build it at an enormous scale. The walls are still standing not because they're impossible. They're standing because they were built by people who understood something true about how stone and stress and motion interact, expressed the only way they had the tools to express it, one carefully fitted joint at a time. If you found this as fascinating as I did, let me know in the comments what other ancient engineering mysteries you'd want covered next, and subscribe for more deep dives into the science behind the world's most incredible ancient structures.